tilted its head to the side in this unnatural, twitchy, bird-like motion. The movement was jarring and inorganic. From the darkness outside, a voice called out. It was not a guttural growl, a hiss, or an animalistic screech. It was human speech. More specifically, it was my exact voice, calling out into the freezing night air. Mark. Story 1. The Wexford County Checkpoint. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I've been a long-haul commercial truck driver for over 20 years. And if you drive a rig long enough, the hypnotic rhythm of the midnight highway just becomes a part of your blood. On February 14th, 2026, I was deadheading, driving my heavy commercial cab without a trailer attached, heading back to my depot in Michigan. I was cutting through the dense, foreboding woodlands of Wexford County on 11-Mile Road. It is a 2-lane rural route heavily flanked by the oppressive pines of the Manistee National Forest. That night, the region was locked in a bitter freeze. A blinding whiteout snowstorm had turned the rural asphalt into a treacherous, isolated corridor of pure ice. The isolation out there during a winter storm is profound. It's a liminal space where human presence is quickly erased by the falling snow, leaving only the darkness and the sweeping beams of your headlights. I had the heat blasting and a thermos of black coffee keeping me tethered to reality. Navigating the snow-covered asphalt required total concentration, which is why my foot instinctively hovered over the brake pedal. Suddenly, my high beams struck a massive obstruction situated directly in the center of the pavement, maybe 50 yards ahead. Operating on pure instinct, I engaged the air brakes. The heavy, trailerless cab slid dangerously, fighting for traction on the black ice before coming to a shuddering, violent halt approximately 30 feet from the mass. My initial cognitive processing tried to categorize the threat to stave off panic. Looking through the driving snow, I muttered out loud to myself, "It's just a downed elk." It was a massive mound of dark, matted fur, completely blocking both lanes. I unbuckled my seatbelt, reaching for the heavy Maglite flashlight I keep by the door, thinking I'd have to lay on the horn to scare it off, or worse, put it out of its misery. But before my hand even grasped the cold metal of the flashlight, the fragile mental framework I had built was instantly and violently dismantled. The mound of dark, snow-caked fur began to move. The horror escalated so exponentially that my brain simply stopped processing time correctly. The creature didn't get up on 4 legs in the manner of a bear or a wounded deer. It pushed itself off the icy pavement and rose entirely on 2 legs, exactly like a massive man pushing himself up from the ground. The sheer scale of the creature was absolutely paralyzing. It stood an estimated 7 feet tall, its broad shoulders practically touching the falling snow. It possessed a chest musculature akin to a professional powerlifter, heavily corded with muscle beneath thick, bristling black fur. But it was the head that shattered my understanding of the natural world. Resting atop those massive human-like shoulders was the gigantic, terrifyingly lupine head of a timber wolf. My breathing stopped completely. I was safely locked inside a multi-ton machine. Yet I had never felt more like exposed prey in my entire life. The entity's anatomy was a grotesque nightmare. Looking down at its lower extremities, I saw that its legs were digitigrade. They bent backward at the hock, exactly like a dog's hind legs. Seeing that anatomical structure forced into a towering, bipedal posture defies every law of biomechanics. It presented a silhouette that triggered a deep, primal, sickening revulsion in the pit of my stomach. The visual horror was soon eclipsed by a sensory assault I will never forget. The creature slowly, deliberately turned its massive wolf head toward my cab. As it turned, its eyes caught the glaring illumination of my headlights. They reflected an unnatural, burning amber color, glowing like hot coals in the blizzard. Those eyes locked onto mine, and the sheer intelligence behind that stare hit me like a physical blow. This was not the vacant, instinctual gaze of a wild animal caught like a deer in the headlights. It was a cold, calculating, deeply predatory assessment. The most terrifying realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. It wasn't looking at my truck. It was looking right through the glass windshield, directly into my eyes. It knew exactly what was inside the metal box. Then came the physical dominance. The creature opened its massive, tooth-lined jaw. I braced myself for a deafening roar or a wolf's howl, but the reality was far more insidious. I didn't hear a sound with my ears. Instead, I felt a deep, violent, rattling vibration in my chest. It was a low-frequency growl, an infrasound weapon that bypassed my eardrums and physically vibrated my rib cage. The frequency instantly induced a wave of profound physiological panic, intense nausea, and absolute muscle paralysis. I physically could not move my hand to put the truck in reverse. The entity was vibrating the very core of my being, asserting absolute territorial supremacy over the frozen highway. After holding me in that state of paralyzed dread for what felt like an eternity, the creature's departure shattered any remaining illusion of reality. Dropping forward onto all fours, it abandoned its human-like posture and moved with a sickening, jerky, spider-like velocity that defied its massive bulk. Without breaking its horrifying momentum, the entity sprinted toward the tree line and effortlessly vaulted a 9-foot steel deer fence bordering the highway. It cleared the obstacle entirely, without a single strand of wire vibrating, and vanished completely into the freezing darkness of the Manistee National Forest. I sat paralyzed in the cab of my truck for 20 minutes before my hands stopped shaking enough to shift the transmission into gear. I drove to the nearest well-lit truck stop and locked myself in the cab until sunrise. I've heard the local legends of the Michigan Dogman, the campfire stories meant to scare children. But I am telling you, that thing on 11 Mile Road was no myth. It was a breathing, mountainous reality, and it let me live simply because it didn't feel like hunting that night. Submitted by Arthur Pendleton to the Digital Cryptid Archive, 11 Mile Road, Wexford County, Michigan, February 14th, 2026. Story 2. The Mimic of Piney Creek. My name is Elena Rostova. My husband Mark and I are high school teachers. By the time spring break rolls around, the sheer exhaustion of the school year leaves us desperate for complete isolation. On April 3rd, 2026, we sought refuge in a beautiful, secluded rental cabin nestled deep in the Ozark Mountains, right off Piney Creek Road in Cleburne County, Arkansas. The Ozarks are characterized by a rugged, deeply fractured topography of dense hardwood forests, steep bluffs, and an extensive network of ancient limestone caves. The landscape is notoriously unforgiving and isolated. Our cabin was entirely surrounded by oppressive, ancient timber. We sought tranquility and a retreat from our exhausting professions. Instead, we became the focal point of a predatory incursion by something that didn't just want to kill us. It wanted to play with our minds first. At approximately 2 a.m. on our third night, the suffocating silence of the Arkansas woods was aggressively shattered. The heavy motion sensor floodlights, positioned high over the cabin's expansive wooden back deck, violently snapped on with an audible click. The sudden blinding illumination cast harsh, angular shadows across the heavy timber railings and the encroaching forest edge. Mark, operating under the annoyed assumption of a mundane intrusion, perhaps a foraging raccoon or a wandering black bear looking for garbage, groaned, got out of bed, and walked out to the living room. He approached the large floor-to-ceiling glass sliding door to investigate, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. I followed a few steps behind him, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. I watched from the interior of the darkened kitchen as Mark reached the glass. Instantly, his entire body went completely rigid. He locked up in a state of sudden, absolute paralysis. His hands slowly rose, pressing flat against the glass, his breath fogging the pain. "Mark?" I whispered, walking up behind him. I looked past his shoulder, out through the glass, and witnessed an entity that defied all rational biological classification. It was a living, breathing nightmare. Crouching atop the heavy timber railing of the deck, bathed in the stark, artificial white glare of the floodlights, was a humanoid entity of absolutely appalling proportions. The physical presence of the creature induced an immediate and severe sensation of the uncanny valley. That profound revulsion you experience when witnessing something that is almost human, but fundamentally and horribly wrong. The creature was completely hairless, lacking even eyebrows or eyelashes. It was wrapped in a pale, sickly, ash-gray skin that was stretched with such horrifying tension over its emaciated, skeletal frame that the underlying bones and joints protruded sharply against the light. Its proportions were entirely grotesque. The limbs were impossibly long and appeared double-jointed, folded awkwardly in upon themselves like the spindly legs of a massive, pale arachnid. The entity gripped the thick wooden railing of our deck with digits that elongated into long, black, needle-like fingers, digging into the solid timber with terrifying, effortless strength. My heart hammered in my throat. I couldn't scream. But the zenith of the visual horror was the creature's face. It lacked any evolutionary markers of terrestrial mammalian life. There was no nose, only two flat, rudimentary vertical slits that flared slightly as it breathed. Where eyes should have been, there were only two hollow, pitch-black voids. They were empty, abyssal sockets that seemed to swallow the artificial floodlight rather than reflect it. The creature's jaw hung loosely open, revealing rows of sharp, translucent, needle-like teeth that looked more akin to the dental structure of an anglerfish than a land-dwelling animal. Mark and I stood frozen behind the fragile, transparent barrier of the sliding glass door, separated from this atrocity by only half an inch of glass. Then, the entity initiated its most horrifying psychological predatory mechanism. It tilted its head to the side in this unnatural, twitchy, bird-like motion. The movement was jarring and inorganic. From the darkness outside, a voice called out. It was not a guttural growl, a hiss, or an animalistic screech. It was human speech. More specifically, it was my exact voice. The entity perfectly replicated the pitch, the cadence, and the desperate, frightened inflection of my own voice, calling out into the freezing night air. "Mark," my voice echoed from the creature's unmoving, slack jaw. "Mark, come out here. I need help." The psychological implications of that mimicry broke my brain. It was utilizing a hunting tactic designed to exploit the deepest human instincts of love and protection. The cognitive dissonance inflicted upon my husband in that moment was palpable. He was hearing his wife begging for her life from the dark woods, while simultaneously feeling my physical presence standing right behind him inside the cabin. He actually took his hand off the glass and reached for the door handle, completely hypnotized by the sound of my distress. "Mark, don't!" I shrieked, grabbing the back of his shirt and violently yanking him away from the door. The sudden movement broke the spell. The creature's head snapped toward us, its hollow black sockets locking onto our movement. It let out a piercing, vibrating, mechanical clicking sound that rattled my teeth. Realizing that a thin pane of glass offered absolutely no true protection against an entity capable of such malevolent intelligence and anatomical horror, we retreated in blind, chaotic panic. We ran down the hall and locked ourselves in the windowless interior bathroom, the only room without exterior access. We sat on the tile floor, clutching a heavy metal flashlight as a weapon, entombed in absolute terror until the sun finally rose and we felt safe enough to call the local sheriff. When law enforcement arrived, they found no rational explanation. There were no footprints of a known animal and no sign of human trespassers. The only physical evidence of the nightmare that had perched upon our deck were deep, violent, parallel gouges shredded entirely through the heavy timber railing by needle-like claws. We packed our bags and left Arkansas that morning. I still cannot sleep without a fan on high, terrified that if the room gets too quiet, I'll hear my own voice calling to me from the dark hallway. Submitted by Elena Rostova to the paranormal documentation site Piney Creek Road, Cleburne County, Arkansas, April 3rd, 2026. Before we head into the brutal Appalachian thunderstorms for our final towering nightmare, I have a question for you. Elena and Mark were nearly lured outside by a creature perfectly mimicking Elena's exact voice. If a monster used the voice of the person you love most to beg for help in the dark, do you think you'd be strong enough to keep the door locked? Drop your honest answer in the comments below right now. And if these human-centric creature encounters are keeping you on the edge of your seat, take 1 second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Creepy Digest. Now, let's head into the mountains, where something massive is waiting in the rain. Story 3. The Appalachian Winged Horror. My name is Samuel Reyes. I work as an emergency utility line technician in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. It is some of the oldest, most rugged terrain on Earth, a region steeped in dense mists, deep river gorges, and an inescapable aura of ancient secrecy. On the night of May 19th, 2026, I was dispatched to Tucker County, near the towering Cascades of Blackwater Falls State Park, right off State Route 32. A severe, violent thunderstorm was sweeping through the central portion of the state, bringing torrential rain, brilliant flashes of lightning, and quarter-sized hail. Working high-voltage utility lines in a severe thunderstorm is inherently fraught with mortal danger, demanding extreme focus and steady nerves. I had just finished repairing a critical piece of infrastructure damaged by fallen timber. I was completely alone on a desolate stretch of highway, enveloped by red spruce and eastern hemlock. Yet, it was not the lethal voltage of the power lines or the fury of the storm that brought me to my knees that night. Having completed the hazardous repair, I lowered the bucket and was in the process of packing my heavy, rain-soaked gear into the side compartments of my commercial service truck. The rain was driving hard, stinging my face. The night was completely pitch black, illuminated only by the aggressive flashes of lightning and the spinning amber strobe lights on the roof of my cab. It was in this specific moment of vulnerability, completely immersed in the deafening noise of the thunderstorm, that I was overcome by a sensation that predates human civilization. I was hit with an overwhelming, suffocating sense of dread. It was a sudden, visceral spike in adrenaline unprompted by any immediate visual or auditory cue. It was the pure biological instinct of being hunted. I paused, my hands resting on the metal door of the tool compartment. I noticed a sudden, highly localized shift in the environment. The air around the truck suddenly felt incredibly heavy and dense, like the atmospheric pressure had suddenly, violently dropped to zero. It was a distortion of reality that made my ears pop aggressively. As I nervously reached for the door handle of my cab, seeking the sanctuary of the vehicle, the entity made its arrival known. It didn't screech or vocalize. It arrived with catastrophic kinetic force. Something of immense, impossible mass slammed directly onto the reinforced roof of my service truck. The impact was so unbelievably severe that the heavy-duty suspension of the commercial vehicle actively groaned, the steel springs violently compressing under the sudden weight. I stumbled backward, slipping on the wet asphalt, backing away slowly into the torrential rain. I raised my heavy flashlight and shined the beam up toward the cherry picker boom of my truck. What I saw perched atop the heavy machinery was an entity that completely shattered the boundaries of known zoology. It forced me, a rational, grown man, to confront the horrifying reality that monsters still exist in the dark corners of the world. I can find no other word to describe it than a gargoyle. It was an entity reminiscent of ancient, demonic stone sentinels. The creature stood perched on two thick, muscular legs, an estimated 8 feet tall. It was entirely devoid of hair, fur, or feathers. Instead, its body was covered in a uniform, abyssal charcoal black, leathery skin, blending almost perfectly with the stormy night sky. It was wrapped in a mantle of massive, folded, bat-like wings that I estimated to span at least 15 feet. A wingspan that completely defies the aerodynamic capabilities of any known terrestrial biology. But the horror of its sheer, oppressive size was eclipsed by its facial anatomy, or rather, the terrifying lack thereof. The creature did not possess a distinct head or a discernible neck. Instead, its visual organs were embedded directly into its massive, heavily muscled upper torso. I stared, paralyzed in the rain, into two glowing, crimson-red eyes set deep into its shoulders. The eyes were not merely reflective in the manner of nocturnal animals catching my flashlight beam. They were actively luminescent. They radiated a self-contained, infernal, glowing red light that pierced the blinding rain, staring down at me with an intellect that felt ancient and full of malice. The terror of this Appalachian horror lay in its complete and utter dominance of the physical space. The entity did not roar. It did not flap its wings aggressively. It sat upon the heavy machinery in absolute, impossible, deafening silence, merely staring down at me, weighing my life. Its presence actively altered the physical environment around it. Despite the freezing, driving rain and the heavy winds of the West Virginia storm whipping around me, I experienced a profound thermal anomaly. I could actually feel an intense, suffocating wave of heat radiating off the creature's black skin in the cold rain. It was like standing next to an open blast furnace. The juxtaposition of the silent, staring, crimson eyes and the suffocating wave of heat created a sensory overload of pure, unadulterated dread. After a few agonizing seconds of being completely weighed and judged by the entity, the creature initiated its departure. It slowly, deliberately unfolded its massive, 15-foot leathery wings. The sheer size of them blotted out the amber strobe lights of my truck. When it launched itself straight up into the violent storm, it completely defied the laws of physics. There was no sound of flapping wings. There was no auditory indication of biological exertion or struggle against gravity. Instead, there was only a violent, explosive rush of displaced air. The creature generated a concussive wave of atmospheric pressure so severe that it literally knocked me off my feet. I flew backward, landing hard on my back on the wet asphalt, the breath knocked entirely from my lungs. I gasped for air, looking up into the sky. The entity had vanished seamlessly into the raging thunderstorm, completely swallowed by the black clouds. It left behind absolutely no physical evidence, save for the compressed suspension of my truck rocking back into place. And the profound, lingering psychological trauma burned into my brain. I didn't pack the rest of my tools. I crawled into the cab of my truck on my hands and knees, slammed the door, locked it, and drove for 3 unbroken hours back to civilization. I was a man hunted by a gargoyle in the modern age, and I absolutely refused to stop my vehicle until I was entirely surrounded by the artificial, fragile safety of blinding city lights. I quit my job the next week. I will never step foot in the Appalachian Mountains again. Submitted by Samuel Reyes to the Regional Folklore and Anomaly Database, State Route 32, Tucker County, West Virginia, May 19, 2026. There is a comforting, fragile delusion we all subscribe to when we lock our doors at night. We believe that humanity has entirely conquered the natural world. But as these three terrifying accounts prove, we are still on the menu. If you found yourself stranded in a storm with a massive winged creature staring down at you, what would be your first move? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If these supernatural encounters made you reconsider your next camping trip, hit that like button, subscribe to Creepy Digest, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. The world is vast, the forests are deep, and the monsters of folklore are very real. Stay safe, trust your survival instincts, and whatever you do, never open the door to a voice in the dark. Good night.